Welcome to the first in the series of Ottomans Online, the Skilliter Center seminars on the Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic. The inaugural talk will be given by Professor Palmira Brummett, Professor Emerita in the Department of History at the University of Tennessee. Professor Brummett, who is of course very well known to you all, has published extensively on wide-ranging fields of Ottoman history, from Levantine diplomacy and Ottoman eastward expansion in the 16th century, to the Ottoman press in the early 20th century, and to mapping the Ottomans both physically and metaphorically, which she discusses in her latest book, Mapping the Ottomans' Sovereignty, Territory and Identity in the Early Modern Mediterranean, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. Her talk today is on the 17th century Venetian traveller Ambrosio Bembo and is entitled Ambrosio Bembo, Visualizing Ottoman Space and Authority, the Traveller in 1671. Just before I hand over to Professor Brummett, the next talk is on Tuesday, November the 3rd at 16:30 UK time, and will be given by Dr. Onur İşçi from Bilkent University. Dr. İşçi will be talking on Turkish diplomacy and the 1936 Montreux Convention. I will now hand over to Professor Brummett.
Thank you, Kate and Ebru and Eve. It's a pleasure for me to be at the Skilliter, so to speak. I always think of the Skilliter Center over the years as having been a place of great conversation. So it's a little strange to be here not seeing the audience, but I hope that all of you in these difficult times are surviving one way or the other. In the meantime, I guess we'll all have to become armchair travelers and imagine that we were at the Skilliter enjoying each other's company in person. So now for our protagonist, Ambrosio Bembo, who died in 1705. Bembo was a 19-year-old Venetian youth already practiced in warfare against the Turk, who set out to see the world in August of 1671, something we certainly can't do right now. En route to Iran and India, Bembo spent 15 months in Aleppo, where his uncle Marco Bembo had been posted as Venetian consul. After leaving Aleppo, his party traveled north and east into Anatolia to what I would call the limit towns of Biricik on the Euphrates and Diyarbakir on the Tigris. From there, he headed down the river to Baghdad and Basra. Departing Iraq, he then traveled on to the west coast of India, and he returned to Venice in 1675. Traveling from the Persian Gulf overland through Safavid Iran and stopping again in Aleppo on his way back. On this return trip in September 1674 in Isfahan, he met and engaged the French artist Guillaume Joseph Grilot, who produced the illustrations for Bembo's Viaggio, which ultimately remained unpublished. Those illustrations, Bembo notes on the first page of his travelogue, would enable him to, quote, provide more pleasure for his readers. Just a note on sources here. There are two available manuscripts of the Viaggio in Asia, one in the Bell Library at the University of Minnesota and the other in Bergamo in Italy. Antonio Invernizzi has published a side-by-side edition of these two manuscripts, and there are some significant differences between the two of them. And Clara Bargellini and Anthony Welch have published an English translation of the Minnesota manuscript, with Welch commenting on both Bembo and Grilot. For Ottoman government in Syria at the time of Bembo's travels, some things you might find interesting, although I imagine many of you here are very familiar with these sources, are Charles Wilkins, Forging Urban Solidarities, Ottoman Aleppo, 1640 to 1700, Bruce Masters, Edhem Eldem, and Daniel Goffman, The Ottoman City Between East and West, Aleppo, Izmir, and Istanbul, or many of the other things that Masters has written on Aleppo. And then Thabit Abdullah, Merchants, Mamluks, and Murder, the Political Economy of Trade in 18th Century Basra, which deals with a somewhat later period, but gives one a good sense of the commerce going through this port. But it's not so much the nature of Ottoman governance that interested me about Bembo's story. I wanted to take this travel narrative and see just what Ottoman space and Ottoman authority looked like. How do they appear to Bembo's readers, including us? Of course, we have maps of Syria at the time, and we have various Ottoman defters and documents suggesting provincial settlements and their revenues. And quite a bit has been written about that. But for Bembo, Ottoman Syria and Iraq were not provincial blocks centered in Damascus and Baghdad. They were spaces where, in certain urban centers, the traveler could rely on the security of what he called real Ottoman authorities. Beyond those centers, the traveler could not count on either documents of protection or claims to some sort of official status. In short, for Bembo, Ottoman authority was centered and contested in a set of major urban nodes, with Aleppo and Baghdad chief among them. Ottoman space was marked out by these major and also minor urban nodes and fortresses. And beyond those were the spaces in between. So sovereignty here in Bembo's narrative looked like an itinerary. There's one exception, however, to this model, and that's the Tigris River. The river on which Evliya Çelebi, the famous Ottoman raconteur, counted out hundreds of vessels as he traveled down the river. For Bembo, the Tigris was a narrow channel of Ottoman authority marked out by the visibility of janissaries. Our historiography, I think, tends to look at these regions at times in two ways. On the one hand, these were places of routine insurrection and rebellion caused by local warlords and the Ottoman Safavid struggle for dominance. Or they were regions counted and incorporated into the Ottoman system of governance and taxation. But Bembo's interpretation suggests something in between these two options. He called Aleppo the last place in Syria where Ottoman authority was actually recognized. And beyond the walls were places of robbers, bandits, and Kurds who refused to submit to the Sultan. Although on his travels, Bembo actually talks a little bit more about the robbers than he actually sees the robbers. The traveler dealt with this question of security using a variety of means: money, ingenuity, good planning, and his integration into a network of urban male corporate establishments. Indeed, Bembo's narrative and his stay in Aleppo resonate with 2 points made by Goran Stanovukovic in his study of English prose romances. And it's called Knights in Arms, Prose Romance, Masculinity, and Eastern Mediterranean Trade in Early Modern England, 1565 to 1655, published Toronto, 2016. Now you may say that a travel account is not a roman, but the genres resonate against each other. Stanovukovic argues, first, for the notion of the corporate household that brings together Western and Eastern men. And second, he highlights the role of romances as, quote, fictions stylizing mercantile contacts, conflicts, and exchanges. Now, Bembo was certainly part of an extended masculine corporate and commercial household that drew in local authorities as well as the agents of foreign nations who were often long-term residents of the city. These affiliates were themselves members of extended corporate households involving both spatial and personal networks. They were an adaptation of the Mediterranean household, combining political, economic, literary, and sexual power that was so eloquently described by Walter Andrews and Mehmet Kalpaklı in their Age of Beloveds. Indeed, Bembo, I think, can be described as participating in a series of expatriate salons. By the time of Bembo's arrival, these intersecting corporate households had a well-developed set of rituals of interaction that tamed and contained conflict. And while Bembo's narrative was a travelogue rather than a romance, there's little doubt that he inherited a set of stylizations for telling commerce, conflict, and Ottoman space that met certain expectations of his readers. Bembo also provided a narrative model that is remarkable, both for its links to those of earlier Renaissance travelers, such as the Relazioni, and for its resonances with the grand tour and colonial genre of a later era. For Bembo, the notion of the world traveler was taken for granted. He introduces various of the figures he meets en route as world travelers, with whom he felt a certain bond of familiarity. So if we want to devise a designation, we might call Bembo an ethnospatial traveler, an indication of his political context, his style of description, and his determination to chart the stages of travel in images. Bembo gauged his travel experience in terms of degrees of Ottoman authority, in terms of ethnocultural identities, and alternate forms of dominion. He used Aleppo and its environs as a case study by which the nature and limits of Ottoman authority were measured. In these places, a traveler had to rely on his wits, on a hodgepodge assortment of intermediaries, and it was a hodgepodge assortment, on new acquaintances and fellow travelers in order to secure his objectives. So now I'd like to present you with a few brief examples of how this worked. For Bembo, governance functioned across territories labeled Turk, Turkman, Arab, and Kurd. On their way down the Tigris, Bembo noted that his party was plagued by the threat of Kurdish and Arab robbers who would try to ambush their rafts and kill the occupants. In these mountainous regions, he suggested, empires do not rule, and even the peasants go armed. Quote, these people do not render obedience to Turks or Persians, and they govern themselves in the villages as do the people of the islands of the archipelago. And to me, this is an interesting type of comparison that we see elsewhere as well. The notion of the mountain people or the desert people in the Arab provinces as compared to the mountainous peoples of the archipelago of the Adriatic and the Aegean. Conversely, Baghdad, for example, was, quote, governed by a pasha who is a vizier, by a qadi, by a mufti, and by a grand aga of the Janissaries, like the one in Constantinople. So Bembo characterizes the struggle for control from the Ottoman center by distinguishing between real Ottoman authority and the authority of local warlords. Agas sent from Istanbul controlled real Janissaries, quelli veri, as opposed to those who simply collected their pay without performing their service. Before Bembo departed Aleppo, his uncle obtained letters from the Capuchin and Carmelite fathers so that he might obtain money in any place where these fathers had an establishment. And this was very conventional practice, as Kate knows better than I do. He also took, he says, 2 letters of recommendation from the Turkish commanders of Aleppo, and 1 additional one from the Aga of Biricik, who happened to be visiting in Aleppo at the time. When, however, his caravan arrived at Biricik, 182 kilometers northeast of Aleppo on the Euphrates, he found that the letter from the Aga was not honored. Instead, a rather intriguing negotiation took place, intriguing but also familiar. Agents of the Aga approached Bembo at the Khan, located outside of town, and demanded a zakino for each person in his party. Bembo presented his letter, but to no avail. He had already paid in Aleppo in a variety of ways. When the agents persisted, Bembo threatened to send a courier to Aleppo to complain to their Aga. And at that point, he says they quieted down a little. But still trying to get as much as possible, they asked some Maronite Christians to tell Bembo to give them something. So Bembo gave them half a piastre for each traveler, but they insisted that that was too little. Then the local Aga of the Janissaries intervened, and he forced the officials to accept half a piastre per person. And Bembo was heartened by this. He said, good, their insolence was finally over. But then the Janissary Aga demanded another half piastre per person in return for his own intervention. Bembo tells his readers that half a piastre might not seem like much of a gift for somebody who was an aga of the Janissaries. But, and here's the critical phrase, he says, in those parts, even if the titles are the usual ones, neither the persons nor the jurisdictions are the same. Here, the traveler is highlighting the distinction between officials sent from Istanbul, like those in Aleppo, and local officials whose identity could not always be clarified very readily. He also suggested that if this had been a real aga of the Janissaries, his party could have been expected to pay more. In effect, it was not surprising that local officials demanded money from travelers. That was conventional. But the medium through which Bembo had expected to negotiate those demands, his documents and previous payments in Aleppo, had lost their validity. At Biricik, Bembo concluded that the jurisdiction of the Pasha of Aleppo ends. From Biricik, the caravan, augmented by more merchants and more armed men, headed east to Diyarbakir. There, Bembo was warmly received by Capuchin friars who redeemed his goods from the customs station without any charge. And he says, and they didn't even look through them because of the intervention of the friars. The Turks here, Bembo tells us, contrary to custom, were very fond of all the Capuchin fathers. In Diyarbakir, in other words, negotiations proceeded smoothly with the assistance of local intermediaries who had some status. Bembo comments that his letters from various Ottoman officials in Aleppo would have been of no use to him here. In fact, he says that the aga of the customs of Diyarbakir, to whom one of his letters was specifically addressed, had been killed trying to collect taxes from the surrounding Kurdish towns, despite that he had, Bembo claims, an entourage of 500 horsemen, which is probably an exaggeration. Bembo then says that the Musellim, the administrative assistant in Diyarbakir, had, quote, immediately sent news to the port and was awaiting orders regarding punishment of the Kurds. It's interesting then to reflect on this vision of Bembo in Diyarbakir bearing a letter of protection addressed to a no longer extant Ottoman official, something that happened often enough given the travel and information distances we're dealing with here. Departing Diyarbakir, Bembo's party boarded rafts for the journey down the Tigris. On this leg of the journey, we see how ephemeral the sense of Ottoman authority could be. Interestingly, for Bembo's party, it turned out that his large rented raft departed Diyarbakir just 3 hours after a flotilla of 3 other calics. And this flotilla, he says, was full of Janissaries, with the luggage of the great aga of the Janissaries of Babylon, that is Baghdad. On the first of these calics was the son of the aga with his father's things, along with 2 Oda Basha, who were captains of approximately 100 Janissaries, the real ones, he says, from Constantinople, who have their quarters in that city. And in another calic, there were 2 other Oda Basha with their serving people and families, and on the third was a Subasha. Bembo's party encountered this flotilla on and off during the course of their journey. It embodied for him a continuity of Ottoman authority all the way down the Tigris. Later in the trip, Bembo also encountered Ottoman officials and Janissaries as they passed a convoy of 3 boats going upstream. These men, he said, had been sent to collect the possessions of, quote, the Pasha of Basra, a very rich man who had only recently died. In effect, then, we have 2 visions of Ottoman authority as Bembo pursues his journey. One is the vision of a dangerous, unprotected water voyage between 2 major cities, during which Kurd or Arab bandits on both sides of the river threaten the safety of the voyagers. But the second is the idea of a thin channel of Ottoman authority that flows down the river from Diyarbakir and then back from Basra and Baghdad. And an interesting question here really is, how does Bembo know who's on these boats and what they're doing? What is the nature of the conversation that's going on amongst these vessels as they pass each other and stop at certain select points down the river? Shortly after leaving Diyarbakir, Bembo and his party reached the town of Hisankeyf and stopped to make a purchase. There, the Aga of the castle sent for their boatmen to make them pay a fee. Bembo says this official had not been able to demand any money from the flotilla commanded by the son of the Aga of the Janissaries of Baghdad. The reason, he says, is because they were Janissaries. They were exempt. So this episode illustrates the hierarchy of boats on the Tigris, who has to pay, as we know, and who doesn't. Having arrived in Baghdad, Bembo commented further on the nature of Ottoman authority and on the ways it might be challenged or reinforced. The current incarnation of Babylon, he said, had been taken and retaken by the Turks and Persians and is now subject to the Ottoman Empire. A great Aga of the Janissaries there, like the one in Constantinople, has under him 10,000 paid Janissaries, although in effect there are not more than 6,000 or 7,000 who collect pay. The rest are shopkeepers who, in order to enjoy Janissary privileges, leave their pay to the Aga, who absolves them from military service. And then he goes on to say, and of these maybe only 2,000 are real Janissaries. Bembo tends to triangulate the cities of Constantinople, Aleppo, and Baghdad. These were the spaces from which Ottoman authority could be projected. And one can readily see the importance of Baghdad for the Ottomans, who established their authority through a set of imperial governors and a large number of Janissaries sent from the capital. The reasons for this projection of power are also clear. The high volume of important river traffic, the ongoing struggle with the Safavids of Iran, and the inclination of the local population, at least parts of it, to the Shi'i persuasion, which Bembo comments upon. But in Baghdad, Bembo also saw the struggle for authority acted out on a more personal level. We know that he was in the habit of meeting up with expatriates in the various cities that he visited, and that set of meetings, in fact, in Bembo was quite interesting. One such companion was a renegade, a Greek from the port of Chania on Crete, and Bembo calls him the artillery pasha, Topacı Basha. He'd valiantly served Sultan Murat IV, for which the Sultan had awarded him a villa in Damascus province some time ago, apparently. This man was an energetic 75-year-old, and Bembo says he was obligated to go every year to Baghdad to check the cannons and to stay there for a certain time. And this again reinforces the notion, whether we're talking about the 15th century or the 17th century, that anyone with artillery experience is valuable and useful to commanders on all sides. But here Bembo presents us with a little dramatic scene right out of Shakespeare. The artillery pasha, he says, purchased a female Georgian slave, and that created a problem because the manager of his khan asked him for the customary 2 piastre fee for this merchandise. And Bembo says the artillery commander then covered him with insults. So the man backed off because of the commander's status, but he asked him to at least tell him who had sold him the slave so that he could ask the latter for a fee. The response was more and worse insults. The manager then went to the pasha of the city, Bembo says, with a bribe and a claim that the commander had bought a Turkish, that is a Muslim woman. Summoned to the Baghdad court, the artillery commander arrived with his slave, who kissed the cross in the presence of everyone to prove that she was a Christian. Nonetheless, the pasha reprimanded the artillery commander, who responded so rudely and audaciously that the pasha was incensed and gave him 3 or 4 slaps on the head with his hand. At that, the artillery commander put his hand to his knife. Now, this scenario was far from a common one, but Bembo's narrative of the renegade who is never named becomes even more dramatic. He says the artillery commander threatened to kill himself, knowing that he was held in such high esteem by the palace elites in Istanbul that the pasha would have to pay for such an incident with his head. Thinking better of the confrontation, the pasha put the artillery commander under house arrest in the house of an aga, but that aga did not want to get involved in this no-win situation. So the aga went to the Father Superior of the Capuchins, and together they, quote, laid out for the Pasha the disorders that might ensue should this struggle continue. So the Pasha relented, and the freed commander, with his slave in tow, left town for Damascus that same evening. This telling, of course, begs the question of genre. What are the borders of the tall tale that Robert Dankoff reminds us of when he speaks of the Ottoman mentality of Evliya Çelebi? This is a standard narrative in some ways, but it's also quite an unusual one. The reader can imagine that Bembo may have incorporated a few distortions or embellishments into the tale. Then again, one has no trouble imagining that conflicts of this nature over status and hierarchy certainly did take place. But this tale, with its elaborate cast of characters, does reveal some interesting dynamics of the negotiation in a provincial capital. There, the renegade somehow felt himself more Ottoman than the resident Pasha. And it was the Father Superior of the Capuchins, allied with the unnamed aga, who got the contenders to settle their dispute. Well, Bembo soon resumed his journey down the river to Basra, and he hired a boat, a barca, but when he arrived at the waterfront, he found the owner absent and his boat almost full of other people's goods. 5 Turks also having boarded without his knowledge. Bembo decided not to protest, wishing to avoid an altercation. And here it's important to remember that Bembo is only 20 years old, even though he was an experienced soldier. But then the aga of the Janissaries sent a request that Bembo allow 2 of his Janissaries to travel on the boat, which delayed its departure. Now this request could suggest familiarity between the traveler and the aga, but more probably it may suggest a simple imposition made by a person in authority. Finally, as they sailed along, Bembo's party was hailed by guards at a town along the way who demanded a toll, and this was conventional. Every stopping place and some non-stopping places demanded a toll. In order to pay less, Bembo tells us, one of the Turks on Bembo's boat pretended to be an aga, and an Armenian Christian named Gabriel pretended to be a Janissary. They claimed to represent an aga on their boat. But the local officials came down to the boat, unfortunately, and, quote, recognizing from his speech that the supposed aga was not from Constantinople, they asked for a toll of 6 reals. Now, this narrative raises the question of who exactly constitutes a real Ottoman, how that person is recognized, and what authority that person is able to project. Further down the river, the travelers did manage to trick local authorities and pay a lesser toll. This may be another tall tale designed to amuse Bembo's readers, but it also suggests the ambiguity intrinsic to Bembo's narrative, in which we have Janissaries of all sorts, many unnamed agas, and an Ottoman authority that is routinely compromised. So, in Bembo's narrative, we have a vision of space, with Constantinople, Baghdad, and Aleppo triangulated, that equates Ottoman authority with the stages of an itinerary, that measures Ottoman authority in terms of the presence of real Janissaries, that highlights the importance of intermediaries over documents, and that asks the question, when is an aga not an aga? And now I thought maybe you'd just like to get a quick glimpse of some of the images from Bembo's narrative. Hopefully I can get this up. How does it look? Okay, okay. All right, so this is the map from Bargellini and Welch's volume showing Bembo's trajectory from Venice to the coast of the subcontinent, landing at Due, and It's a little off here on the map, as we see, because Biricik is on the Euphrates, not the Tigris, but you get the sense of the extent of his journey in this map down to Baghdad and Basra. This is a conventional scene, the entrance of the consul into Aleppo and the parade that ensued. And Bembo gives a lot of attention to describing that, and he puts little vignettes done by Grillo in Grillo's drawings of probably a game of Jirit in the front, and he talks about the spectators watching the entry into the city. We have a set of horses that are brought out as a sign of honoring the consul, and he's mounted on one of these horses. Here we have the consuls, and then consuls, and then we have the nations, the foreigners in the rear. We have a chaush in the front of the party here. Here is a panorama of the city of Aleppo. I couldn't get it all on one slide. There is actually a key off to one side that shows the places that are labeled on the city. But what's interesting here is what's in the foreground. So first we have an image, a bust. It may be Bembo, it may be not, but this is the Bembo family coat of arms in the beginning. And then we get the image of the artists in the foreground. Here's an inset from that drawing, and we have the image of Grillo still dressed in Western dress, although later in the images he will don Turkish and Persian dress. We see him surrounded by his tools. The dates on these images that are dated is 1675, after the return to Venice. And then we see in Grillo's hands the image that he is sketching. This is one of multiple images in Bembo's work that shows the dress of the inhabitants in the places where he is traveling. We have one of the Syrian women at home and one of them dressed for outside, in which they are all covered. And he points out that the Christian women wear the same dress as the Muslim women. This is kind of a conventional image. Bembo had a lot of examples. If we think of what his knowledge picture was in terms of reading narratives, he emphasized Marco Polo and Pietro della Valle quite a bit. And of course, we have the 16th century travel account of Nicholas de Nicolai, the French, that was enhanced by a lot of these costume images. So by Bembo's time, not including costumes in the description, both men and women, and not including images of those costumes would have been rather unusual in an illustrated manuscript. Okay. This is a vision of the passage down the Tigris, and Bembo was very intrigued by the technology of the vessels. So here's the image of the Kalek. On the left, the rafts that were made out of inflated skins and wood that was then, they were taken apart when they got down to Baghdad, and the wood was sold. And then the barca, he says, with the elevated stern, which is what analogous to the type of vessel that they took from Baghdad to Basra. But also here we have the wells that he describes that are used to water lands and gardens outside the river. In another image, we see the other side of these wells where oxen are bearing carts and various large vessels full of the water that's been drawn up here from the river. And this is an inset that gives you a closer vision of these wells and of the Kalek as well. Okay. This I include, we haven't really talked about the notion of specific borders. This is the town of Sumbar or Sumar in Western Persia, which Bembo calls the last town of Persia. So the last town that they passed before thinking themselves as entering Ottoman territory on the Kangir River. And Bembo is pretty complimentary about the hospitality and food in Iran, not so complimentary about the hospitality and food he receives on the outskirts in Ottoman territory. But again, this is a visual representation of the border town, if you will, the sense of that division between Safavid and Ottoman space. And this is an image on the voyage back. Bembo went overland from Iran to Baghdad and then up to Aleppo again, and then sailed back to Venice, stopping in Crete. And we can see here the standard kind of indication of an Ottoman port city with the small crescents on the various towers in the port city. But again, what's interesting here is the placement of the author and the artist, not new to Bembo and Grilot's manuscript, into the Ottoman space. And here we see a figure that is presumably Bembo, dressed in Western dress, and Grilot still dressed in Eastern, perhaps Persian dress, and making his sketch of the port city. So the images marked out the spaces, the cities, the monuments, particularly in Iran, of the travel, and also inserted the creators into that visual imaginary. And that's what I've got.